everybody. Welcome back to the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. My name is Ellen. This is episode 28, and I'm here with Sam Dean. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Ellen. Happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Sam reached out to me on email and said that he was interested in coming on the podcast, and he had a few things he thought he could contribute to the conversation that we've been trying to start on this podcast about war and peace. So I said, come on the podcast. We just met a few minutes ago. So Sam, I'm going to ask you to give a little bio of yourself, like a real short overview of who you are and why you're interested in being on the podcast.
Okay. My generation, 1965, end of the Vietnam War. Two brothers that fought in it. I grew up pretty much never thinking anything other than I was going to be in the Army as an officer. Played war growing up, games, sports, high school, loved all those things. Went to college, political science degree, pretty much an officer's degree, ROTC. Joined the Army and served. Had a great time. Started off in a basic branch, and then as a junior captain, transferred to Special Forces. I couldn't think of anything I'd rather do, running around with a bunch of cool guys doing cool things. Very physically challenging, mentally challenging, and you're off by essentially your detachment, your A team was off doing your own stuff. I didn't have, my chain of command was quite often multiple time zones away from me. So yeah, there were no Americans close by. I worked in Russian units. So it was something that I really enjoyed.
What can you tell? Like, what countries were you in? Like, were you in specific wars, or were you? I mean, you were serving from, I think you said 1988 until 2010.
Yeah,
so,
the desert, WWF4, the Desert War against Saddam Hussein. I was with the Special Forces Group. The 90s, I spent multiple tours in the Balkans, Bosnia. Certainly learned a lot of things there about how the military really works. Then in the 2000s, throughout the 1990s, I was all over Europe, Poland, and various countries, Denmark. Spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. I missed Iraq completely. I went to Oman. All the units I would go somewhere else when they would then deploy. I made it to Afghanistan.
Okay, quite a career then. Yeah. And what are you doing now? What have you done since 2010?
We retired, started a little farm, spent a lot of time at the house, an opening at the local seminary as a registrar. My wife thought that maybe I was helping out a little too much around the house. She thought it would be a good idea for me to find a job outside the house, bless her heart. So I'm now the registrar for a Catholic seminary. Okay,
and you have 7 children, right?
We have 7 children, yes.
Okay,
yep.
And
their own, and 4 still in the house.
4 still in the house. All right. Well, wow, quite a lot of experience. So at some point you became Catholic, correct?
I did, yes. My wife is cradle Catholic. We met at the University of Dayton in Ohio, which is a Marianist school. And in 2006, 2004, I in full communion with the church, RCIA, and am proud to be a Catholic to this day.
Okay, so I'm curious. When you were going, so you were still in the military when you were going. I'm sure you were an officer by this point.
I was, yes.
You were going through RCIA. Did anything come up in your heart, mind, soul that made you think? Did anything in the RCIA class make you think, gee, maybe now that I'm becoming a Catholic, I shouldn't serve in the military anymore? Did anything happen like that?
No, I went to Mass every Sunday with my wife. We never miss Mass, multiple church functions, and not once did I ever hear anything about nonviolence, the just war theory, or any other version of it is called the Doctrine. So it really was not an issue. I didn't think it was an issue. I was an officer. My Protestant upbringing, it was very patriotic, so there was never any question about service in the military. And so no, and in our RCIA, I had a lot of kids. I was going through a master's program, and my sponsor had 8 children at the time, and he's an engineer at a Honda plant. And between the two of us, we kind of agreed that one of us had to be awake. So we probably weren't the best students, but the
Yeah.
priests who were giving RCI realized that getting one of us awake was probably a pretty good deal. So I read everything. I never questioned it. It was what I had to do to become a Catholic.
Okay, got it. So at some point you did start to question this. So it seems to me we talked a little bit before we started recording. Some of that questioning started almost more of on a cultural level. You started reading Lou Rock. Well, first of all, you said there was some disappointment with George W. Bush, and so
Yes.
something started to change for you. So what was that path like for you? So you started to question some things.
Yeah, there were certainly some. I mean, I was a small government kind of guy. I thought myself as a constitutionalist and Republican. Voting for George Bush, thought this was great, humble foreign policy, said all the right things, and it was no different than the previous administration. It just got to be, what's the difference? Something's not right here. And so I put a halt to any political activity and voting until I learned more about the political realm. And I was a political science major. I mean, you get all of the approved opinions on it in school. So I started looking for alternative understandings of it.
And I think you mentioned that you voted for this humble foreign policy of George W. Bush, but then you weren't with your family very often because you were
Right.
always
No, I mean,
employed
as a special forces officer, you deploy a lot as it is, but yeah, we seem to be in everybody's business. Nation building, we don't do that. That was George Bush's, comment. I was spending an awful lot of time in foreign nations, not necessarily building them up, but I was doing a lot of deconstruction and reconstruction, I guess. We were busy. And I had seen as a younger officer things that really concerned me, I had trouble with. But as a younger officer, you're just having a great time. You're cool. You're running off doing stuff. You're jumping out of airplanes, fast ripping out of helicopters. You're kicking doors down. You're blowing things up. But two events I think stand out the most when as a captain in the Balkans. And one of the missions I was on, we were looking for war criminals in the northeastern part of Bosnia. And so I spent a lot of time out alone or with one other person, going to seedy places looking for where war criminals hung out and try to find who they were, map out where they lived so that people years down the road could grab them and take them to the Hague for war crimes. And early one evening, I was playing pool with he was probably 15-year-old boy, and he started telling me about his experiences. And he had been in Sarajevo during the heavy fighting. And he just stopped at one point and said, Sam, God will never let me into heaven. I'm like, okay. He said, we would go into an apartment building in Sarajevo and it would be completely dark, and we would kill until the women and children stopped screaming. Yeah. And so my job wasn't to help this kid. And I remember thinking, he's not going to live a year. He's going to blow his brains out. This kid's not going to last. You could just see it in his face. He was distraught. And I went on. I left him. And, is that how a Christian acts? No. But I didn't have time to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so those are the kind of things, you just can't deal with at the time, but you move on and it always sticks with you.
Yeah. That's really sad. But I think that gives us a glimpse at those of us who haven't been in the military, haven't been in war, of what it really is. I don't think we often like to admit what it really entails.
Right. There's nothing glorious about it. Yeah, I mean, all the medals and stuff afterwards, but when you look back at the people you've lost and you remember what it was like when they were, dying, or you're stepping over guys, it's not what, the movies make it out to be. So I was questioning the government and why we were being sent and what these wars we were in. And the last deployment I'm on is as an advisor to an Afghan infantry battalion. And we spent a lot of time in combat. And we were helping the government side, and the locals, the people we would put in charge of their little area after we kicked out the Taliban or the Hezbollah Islami, the locals wanted the Taliban back. Because the folks we were putting in charge of them were much worse than the Taliban were.
Wow.
And so we were fighting and clearing these village complexes and then bringing the good guys in. And a few months later, the locals invited the Taliban back and kicked them out.
Hmm.
So, I was sending guys home. One guy badly wounded, and another officer that was with me had a very bad wounding. And I remember one night we were looking at each other on a battlefield, and we asked each other, "What the heck are we doing?"
What
Um,
were you doing? Like, what did you think you were like? Why are we there? What were you
yeah,
doing?
exactly. That's why are we here? We're clearing this area. It was during the surge, Obama's surge. We knew when the forces that had come in to help left, all of these areas were going to go back to Taliban control, and they did. I've looked at all the areas; they're all red again. So all the places we fought, killed and died over, they're all back to the Taliban, or the Hezbollah Islami. So it didn't make a bit of difference. Um, and we knew at the time that the war was unwinnable. We both assessed that there's no way we can win this war. And the recent publication of the Afghan papers, everyone in the chain of command knew that, but you couldn't say that up the chain of command. We would report it, and we would be told, shut up, and report, the successes you've got.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this started making you question some things. And you said at some point you were reading Lou Rockwell. See, I just like to bring up Lou Rockwell sometimes because I think he is such
Yeah,
a great voice for peace. But I also think that those of us who are the Catholic people who are anti-war are oftentimes just assumed to be these like liberal hippies from the 60s that are,
of
you know,
course.
and,
Yes.
and that's not the case at all. There's plenty of us who consider ourselves more culturally conservative or independent that are not necessarily on the left that are also anti-war. So I just like to
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of point that out. So you were reading Lou Rockwell and you said you stumbled upon an article by Father McCarthy, by Charlie.
I did, yes. And he
Okay.
wrote about the violence of the state, and it made sense. It's like, yes, everything we do within the state, I lived it. Within two or three decisions, you've got somebody sticking a gun in your nose telling you you're going to do it. You can do it voluntarily. It's like a thief coming up and sticking a gun in your ribs, hand over your wallet. Well, you're going to hand it over. Most people will, but did you really give it to him? No, it was under coercion, and that's the nature of the state.
Mhm.
So I had a lot of trouble with, just the very nature of the state. And there's some great authors out there that describe that very well. And Lou Rockwell was in the Mises organization,
Yeah.
is just a great resource for that.
Yeah. So at some point you heard the term just war and you'd never heard anything about the just war theory before. How did you hear about that? Was that after you were a Catholic?
It was, yeah. This is 2010. I retired mid-year, probably 2011, and I was walking down the hall at our parish, St. Patrick's, in Columbus, Ohio, with a priest, Father Tom Blau, and likes military history, and so I'm sure he said it because I was there, knowing that I just retired, and he
Yeah.
started. I don't know how he got on the subject, but that he said the pacifists in the church are just wrong. And he said, and you could even justify, the war against the Plains Indians, if you were to see it as a defense of Chicago, as if the Plains Indians had any ability to attack Chicago back then. And as a military officer, you spend a lot of time in your schools. Every so many years, you have to go to school to become more educated as an officer.
Okay.
And I understood that the Plains Indians had no way of massing force, all these problems, but I just gotten out of the army. So here's this priest that I really liked says that the pacifists are all wrong, and the just war, is the right way to go, justified violence. And I didn't know the first thing about my church's teaching,
Mhm.
but
Wait,
now I'm
even
starting to.
despite the RCIA class, you still didn't know?
I know, yes, yes, I know. They spent probably 30 seconds reading over it, and I hope I was paying attention at
You
the
might
time.
have been sleeping at that point. So
It
yeah.
was probably one of the two of us. Yeah, I was probably sleeping.
Yeah, even if you were awake, it probably wouldn't have, they didn't spend much time on it. Maybe 30 seconds, like you said.
Right. No, no, no. It was a water hose, fire hose of information trying to drink it, and just I don't remember asking any questions, just hoping that I would, make it to Easter so that
Yeah.
my wife could finally smile and be happy that her husband was a Catholic along with the rest of the family.
Yeah. Yeah. So you heard this and you were like, what is this? Right? Like, what is
Right.
this for?
So, I'm already sensitized to my career. I'd spent a lot of time doing things that I had no business doing. I knew at the time that I shouldn't be doing. As you get older and you start seeing how the sausage is made, you know you shouldn't be out doing these things.
Mm.
And so Father Tom says this, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, I really don't know this. I've got children who are coming of age. I should probably be able to teach them. I take my responsibility as the primary catechist of my children very seriously. I probably, as a retired lieutenant colonel, need to know these things to teach my children.
Yeah.
And so I started researching it. And, the fact that he had said somehow that the Plains Indians were going to attack Chicago was like an exercise in my head, because there's no way for them to do that logistically. They would never be able to do that. So that kind of kicked my brain in. It's like, okay, you don't know much about what you're talking about here, Sam. Let's go find out what the just war doctrine or theory, whatever this thing is. And that's when I started researching it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, the resources weren't all that great. They talked around it. I noticed that the just war theory, the just war doctrine, and the just war tradition, they could be interchanged.
Yeah, what is it? A theory, a doctrine?
Exactly.
When you technically look into it, it's actually a tolerated opinion. So
Right.
It's like, what's the difference between a tolerated opinion, a theory, a doctrine, and a tradition? It's like, yeah, it's very murky, isn't it?
Yes. And in one article, they'll be talking about what seems to me the Catholic just war teaching. And 6 paragraphs later, they're talking about a just war tradition that doesn't seem linked to the teaching anymore. And as a military officer, those are the things you look for, because you can't be an expert on all things. The maintenance guy knows how to fix the trucks, and you don't, but you have to know that when he gives his report, if something is nonsense in it, you have to know enough to say that doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
That's what officers do. I can't be the expert on everything, but I have to be smart enough to say, yeah, Sergeant Jones, that doesn't sound right. I'm not going to my boss and telling him that and, being embarrassed. So let's figure out what's really here. So those are the things I started seeing. And about that time, I got the job at the seminary. And of course, now I've got this wonderful library. And I started reading book after book. And I got to where I could pick up a book, thumb through it, and tell you what the author's argument was. Because if it was nonviolence, there would be resources, references to the Gospels, all kinds of references to writers the first 3 centuries, footnotes everywhere. If there might be 1 or 2 footnotes, not really any references, and Jesus nowhere to be found, he was a justified violence guy.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
And I would quite often look at the sources. I learned long ago that just because somebody sources an idea, to go find the resource, and quite often they didn't have a footnote. It was just their opinion with nothing going back. So it may have been resource or footnoted, but it really wasn't. It was an empty footnote. And those things bother me. You have an argument, make it. I'm listening. I really don't want to find out that my life was a bad mistake. But the more I learned about the just war theory and the church's teaching, the worse it got. I mean, I really became uncomfortable with my wars when I understood what the just war theory requires, the level of certainty you have to know all of those things. I knew all the wars I was in had not met them. I knew they didn't. And I have a problem with unjustified killing.
Right, as we all should.
Yeah, it's murder. But you say that and people kind of shrug their shoulders.
Yeah, well, we have a just war theory, so isn't that just a way to justify, like you say, it's like, is it just violence, or is it just a way to justify the violence? It seems that it is just a way to justify.
It is.
So
yes.
You started looking into this, and so I know that you're not like a moral theologian or whatever, but in this wonderful thing that you've written, which I'm hoping you'll let me publish perhaps on my blog or somewhere, or if it's out there, a link to it or something.
Okay.
Sam has written an incredible, like a personal testimony of what his path has been in trying to research the truth of this. And you basically said that in the seminary, you discovered that the just war theory is not taught. Let's see. You say the curriculum at most Catholic seminaries for the Master of Divinity degree includes 1 or 2 basic Catholic moral theology courses.
Yes.
1 course on medical morality, 1 course on sexual morality, and one on the church's social teachings.
Yeah.
Just war doctrine is not covered in basic moral theology courses. I was blown away when I read this.
No, it isn't.
It's the church's moral doctrine governing the mass killing of human beings is taught in this Catholic social teaching course. Is that
Yes,
true?
it is. Sure
So,
is. Yeah. Just wages, rents, such things, and just war.
okay, so like a fair wage, landlords and tenants, and
Yes.
oh wow. So what is wrong with that? I mean, there's something wrong with that, but you can probably articulate it better than I can.
Oh, sure. I mean, war is the mass homicidal violence. I mean, it's the most horrific thing anyone can imagine. And, I get that abortion is bad. It is. It's horrific. It's evil. So in medical morality, they talk about, how, what the morality of certain medical procedures are, and sexual morality. It's never just unless it's, within a marriage. I get that. But somehow killing human beings on a industrial scale is no more important than somebody getting $10 over $12 an hour.
That's amazing to me. And how much time do they spend teaching the sexual morality course?
But it's an entire semester.
It's an entire semester on sexual
Yes.
morality.
Yeah. Medical morality is an entire semester.
And so just war theory is, so the Catholic social teaching is all one semester.
One semester, yes. All of the social teachings are tucked in. And this particular professor admitted it's the last thing on his list to teach, and quite often he never gets there, because you know how semesters go. Sometimes they just go slow.
Okay, so of the Catholic social teaching semester where they teach just war, which is not where they should be teaching just war.
No, it should have its
own. At the very
own.
end, and it's often not even
in this particular professor's class. Yeah, it was at the end. So that's great. So you don't even teach it quite often, do you? Like, no.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that
priests who never get it. Yeah.
That might explain your experience with your priest. So once you sort of started looking into this, you started going around and kind of asking people about it, right? Because you were trying to find answers, and your parish is a Dominican parish. They're known for being intellects, the scholars.
They'll tell you.
Teachers, right?
Yeah.
So what happened when you went around and started asking people about it to try to learn about it and put all the pieces together?
At the priest level, just the parish priest, most of them had no idea really how to answer it. My parish priest, a very good parish priest, Father Michael Dosh.
And I should ask, what was the question you were asking to them?
Well, by this time, I started with just some of the priests. We have a number of priests in the parish. It was Father Tom Blouse, who I was working with, and we had a couple of people that we were asking questions with. Another former Marine officer and I were talking to Father Tom, and the more we got into it, it was clear that he had to do some learning. And I had learned that the just war theory had nothing to do with Christianity, not even the Old Testament, that it was Cicero. And so I asked Father Tom at one point, well, Father Tom, where does the just war theory come from? And he kind of posited, well, probably the Old Testament or something like that. And he said, well, I don't think it is, Father Tom. Why don't you ask? We asked the schoolhouse in Washington, D.C., the House of Studies for the Dominicans, what it was. And about 2 months later, they came back with, oh, yeah, that's Cicero. And I remember Father Tom coming to me, and the look on his face, he was stunned. This was first century, Roman political philosophy. It's pagan. He did not expect that. And the more we got into it, the more uncomfortable he got. And at one point, he just didn't want to talk about it anymore.
Okay. Yeah, he's like, stop bugging me about this.
Yes. I'm not going to talk about this anymore. You have my opinion on it. It's like, really, Father Tom, I don't have your opinion on it. What do I teach my children? Now that we know we have this problem, in 1600 years, the church has never told their own princeling no for this just war theory. They've always said, yes, go fight. I can't teach my children that.
Right. So, yeah. So your priest didn't even know himself. And a lot of people will say, no, it came from St. Thomas Aquinas. It came from St. Augustine. But
right.
If you trace it back further, they were adopting Cicero. Yeah. And making it a part of the Christian. And it was initially, we have to point out too, written to try to limit Christian participation in war. So you'd think that if it was really working that way, in your 20 experience as a military officer, at some point a Catholic might have come to you and said, I'm sorry, I'm a Catholic. I have a just war theory in my church. I can't do this. Did that ever
Yeah.
happen?
No, 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 no. And I know why now. One, they never taught it. Nobody ever knows it. And you know, as an officer, the priest, the chaplain's job was, of course, saying mass or giving services and whatever you did for the families. But his real job was to make sure Johnny was fighting. And if we had a particularly bad engagement, especially when we had a bad casualty, I brought the chaplains out to make sure the guys were ready to go the next day. I mean, that's
Okay.
not why the chaplain wasn't there to save souls. He could save their soul if he wanted to, but if he saved souls, but I lost soldiers, we were getting a new chaplain.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the
They're
bottom
not
line.
going to keep their job if they're going to try to talk to
Right.
kids about that. And they are kids. They're kids.
Most of them are.
Yeah. So the other thing that you pointed out in this letter is that in your research, you discovered that no bishop in the history of the church, if you all are listening and you can tell us one, this is the challenge of the week. I would love to hear it, but no bishop has ever declared his own country's war unjust at the time it was being fought.
Right, except for John Botein from Canton, the Romanian Catholic Church. He's the only one who's done it. Nobody else, has ever said, "I'm sorry, King George," or whoever, prime minister, premier, presidents. Clearly you have not met the requirements of the just war theory. We can't fight. They've always said, "No, no, we'll fight."
Right. So it's not working. It's just not working. I don't know. I mean,
No,
the way that it was meant to, the way it was intended to, and I think now it's intended to not work. It's intended to be there and
I
not
think it's
work.
always been that way, Ellen.
Yeah.
The more I look at it, the more. Even there's a writer called named Lori Calhoun, and she's not Christian. She's an atheist, as far as I can tell. She looks at it from a purely philosophical standpoint, and she can find no instance where anyone's really used the just war theory in any way to stop a war. On the Christian side, I can't find it either. I've looked. If somebody can find it, I've asked historians. Working in a seminary, I have professors who teach church history. They're experts. They've got their PhDs in all of this. Patristics professors, PhDs.
Wow.
It's not there.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting too because I really appreciate what you said about being the main catechist for your children. Like I wish that more Catholic fathers would see it that way, and that you want to tell them what the church teaches, and that led you to sort of this whole search for what do I teach them? What
Yeah.
does the Catholic Church teach? In your rounds that you made and asked different people, you have a few very short answers that people gave you. Can I read
Yeah.
those out loud?
Sure.
So you said, I've included an excerpt from each of the 3 responses I received to the many letters I wrote.
I probably wrote 24 letters to the Benedictines, the Augustinians, every order or Catholic organization that in my province or region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of mimics my journey as well, because once I became familiar with Father McCarthy, I'm always like, somebody tell me where he's wrong. I don't want that to be my only, because I'm not a theologian, I'm not an expert in history, so I've been waiting for 10 years to have somebody tell me, and nobody can. It's amazing.
Yes, they won't do it.
So the first answer that you got was, I think you have answered your question regarding just war theory doctrine. Through your research of this topic, you could not find a clear answer to what makes a just war. Yes, the Catechism gives some guideline to follow and questions that must be asked. However, in any conflict, be that war or a family dispute, there are no clear answers available. Each individual is charged with the obligation to seek peace and restore harmony, and for this to take place, forgiveness is necessary.
Yeah.
So, okay, doesn't answer the question.
Doesn't answer the question. Nope.
The next one, number 2. Applying the just war doctrine to a particular war is not easy. The just war criteria are very subjective. I would agree with that, actually. Over the years,
Sure.
the just war doctrine was applied to many wars, all of which were declared just. It is difficult to objectively define what is grave, what is certain, what is impractical, what is ineffective, what is serious prospects of success, or what is disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. Also kind of a cop-out,
Oh,
but
sure. Yeah.
but I would say that that's probably a pretty honest answer, because I think that's part of the problem with the whole theory, is that you could spend an entire life trying to figure out, well, what is the meaning of grave danger? What is the meaning of certain? What is the meaning of each one of those words could be debated by 10 different people and they'd have 10 different answers.
Sure they could, but you have to know, I mean, the operative idea with the just worth theory is you have to know to the highest level of moral certainty that the church requires. I mean, a seminarian is, before he can become a priest and get his holy orders, the church has to know that to the level of probability, of certainty, the same level that he's meant to be a priest. And we still make mistakes. I get that, but
yeah. So can you explain that real quick? The three levels of like certainty, like you.
Oh, you've asked that. Do you need to get a moral theologian in here? I've read through it a few times, and I hate that stuff. I was never born to be a moral theologian. I get that.
Yeah.
Probabilism. If I have a chart in front of me, I can tell you.
Yeah.
What I understand is probabilism is the highest level of moral certainty that the church requires. And that's what percentage is that? 75, 70%. I mean, get moral theologians in a room and they probably have a food fight over, what that means.
Yeah.
But I understood it when they gave me an example. I need examples. When a seminarian goes through and he's in his fourth year and he's going to become a priest, receive his holy orders, the level of certainty that the bishop has to know that he's ready to be a priest is probabilism. I mean, he spent 4 years in a seminary being evaluated, all kinds of tests and evaluations and interviews.
Yeah.
Before he can receive his holy orders, they have to know to that level of certainty. So the wars, okay, it doesn't take 4 years to find out if a war meets the just war theory, but you have to make an effort. You have to, okay, well, the Afghanistan war is one of them. The Taliban offered bin Laden if we would simply use the internationally recognized form of transferring a potential criminal. But we didn't want to do that. We refused to use that system and simply attacked. Well, I'm sorry, for a Catholic, that immediately says the war is not just. Have fun storming the castle. We'll be here. We'll be praying for everyone. Let us know how it goes.
Yeah.
That's not what happens.
Right. And I think in order to have that level of certainty, you need information, and you need the true information. And when is our government ever going to give us the true situation?
The first casualty in war is the truth. I learned that long ago. Nothing of what I was fighting for was really what we were fighting for. Yeah. I knew that on the ground.
Wow. Okay. So the subjectivity of all this stuff, that's a problem. The next answer you got was the application of any moral norm is always subject to interpretation. What does it mean in the practical order to be just, for instance? We may all hold justice as a value and have every good intent to live justly, but that in no way means we all view a specific activity in the same way. What one person views as a just solution to an issue may appear unjust to another. We live in a gray world.
Yes, that gray world. I love that one. That was good. Yes.
I mean, how is that not moral relativism right there?
It absolutely is. Yes.
Yeah. So laxism is a way. This is, to me, is what you were calling laxism.
Laxism. Yes.
And we don't want to get in trouble with Father Barron by trying to teach Catholicism on YouTube. He might censor me. We're not trying to teach it. We're just discussing these things. And,
I would hope we can have an intelligent conversation about it. How else do you learn? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are degrees of moral certainty that you have to have as a Catholic to go to war. Right. And this is the highest degree of certainty, which isn't 100% because you can never get to 100%.
You can't. No. Yeah. Then that's tutorism. Absolute tutorism is, when you require too much moral certainty for whatever the issue is. Okay. I mean, there's a low level of moral certainty that a cheeseburger is unhealthy for you. If you make that mistake, do you really pay a heavy price? Probably not. You eat too many cheeseburgers, you get fat and you're obese and you're sloth or whatever.
Yeah.
But going to war is an immediate problem because you're killing people.
Right.
It's killing, and if it's unjust killing, it's murder.
And that's no different than abortion. That's no different than abortion.
No different.
In God's eyes, that's what the church teaches. Unjust murder is unjust. Unjust killing is murder.
Yeah.
So these answers that you got are very they just kind of swim around and they don't really
They're not answers.
Yeah. So then my favorite example that you give in this is that you called EWTN one night.
I did. Yes.
Can you tell that story?
I was driving home from work, and sometimes I listen to music. Sometimes I'll listen to, the local Catholic station, and it was a call-in, and it was about the just war theory, and I couldn't believe it. So I'm probably breaking laws, using my cell phone to call, and I call in. And I think you never the person who gets to in, and I was. They said, oh well, hello, you made okay, just hold here and you'll be able to ask your question. I couldn't believe it, so I asked my question. I'm a retired Army officer, and I've been researching the just war theory, and over the months I haven't been able to find any example of when the bishops in a country have told their princeling, their king, their president, no for a war. They've always said yes. Can you give me an example of when we've followed the just war theory and told our political leaders, no, I'm sorry, your war is not, like hit Germany, the Germans fought, and then what do I teach my children? And these gentlemen had been very calm, and they were joking and having fun with the previous questions. And you would have thought that somebody had let off a stink bomb in their little radio station, because they immediately went into panic mode, and I could hear it in their voices. Oh, well, there are three things they insisted. You would never, tell a politician no, because bad things might happen, like the Dutch, bishops who told the Germans, they were wrong in World War II, and then the Germans, came down on them and crushed them. Well, so you go along with the murder, because they might punish you.
Right. You go along with evil because otherwise something bad might happen to you.
Yes, are we a church of cowards? And I'm trying to think how else they responded with that. You've got it there. It's been a while since I've looked at that.
Oh yeah. You were told that Jesus had no problem with military action because he didn't lecture the Roman centurion.
The Roman centurion, yes, that's one of my favorites, because that's an argument from silence, and I immediately recognize, because I've had that pitched at me a few times. My bishop did that one. It's like, no, but centurions also sacrificed to gods. So Jesus didn't say anything about that. So should we be sacrificing to Roman gods? There was also a bit of homosexuality in the Roman legions. So should we have supported that? And you bring those things up and they don't want to talk about it. So the fact that Jesus doesn't lecture somebody on all of their sins is not an argument.
Yeah, exactly. So you said the state determines. There's a whole thing of it's the government's job to.
Right. Yeah. The argument that only the government can determine if a war is just. And are you kidding me? So Adolf Hitler was right. The Germans were right for following Adolf Hitler because he was the leader of the government. Mussolini, when they were gassing Ethiopians in the 30s, that was okay because the government said that was licit. No, of course it is. You can't. I mean, and the Catechism says no. If the government is doing wrong, you don't follow them. But the just war theory does not say your Caesar, your princeling tells you what's right. You have to determine it yourself whether or not you kill somebody.
And the only way that could possibly theoretically work is if you were living in a country where your president was always assured to be a devout practicing Catholic who knew about the just war theory. But as we know, 90% of devout pious Catholics anywhere don't know about it. So if their government is not using the just war theory to determine whether it's just, why should Catholics who do follow the just war theory follow the government who says it's? You can't. No. It makes no sense.
Yes, and they quickly shut my link off, so I couldn't say anything more. They weren't going to have me speak again. Yeah, I tried to interject, and that was dead. And then they ended it, and I tried to get a copy of that episode so I could, play it. And that's one episode they just can't seem to find.
Really? So it's not, they link to all their episodes online?
They do. Yeah, I went onto the website and tried to find it, and it wasn't there. So I contacted them, and they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Dean. For some reason, we just can't seem to find that one."
Oh, how funny. That I've
Yes.
noticed so many things like that, so many things like that, where it's like everyone
Yes.
wants it to just not be brought up because everyone deep down knows it's a big lie, I think.
Yes. Oh, they
And
do. They're not. Yes, they do.
yeah, but it works for us. In terms of, yeah. So then you went to your bishop and you tried to talk direct. Tell me about that, about this
Yes.
question. I wanted to talk to him about it.
So I've gone through my parish priest, who wouldn't talk to me, and I'm trying to get a meeting with him. And after about a year, I start trying to get a meeting with my bishop and the provincial for the Dominicans of the Eastern Province. I'm The military taught me that when you don't get answers at one level, only spend so much time and then move to the next level. So I can thank the military for that training at least. So I finally get a meeting with Bishop Frederick Campbell. He's no longer a bishop, but um, he finally, I get into his office. I've sent him these letters, called his office, pestered his secretary, and he finally agrees to meet me. So I come in and he says, "Now, Mr. Dean, what, pray tell, could be a topic that only I can answer to you?" So, okay, clearly you haven't read any of my letters. So we sit down and I start asking him about, well, Bishop, I tell him my story, and so what do I teach them for 1600 years? Nobody has ever told their political leader no, so I can't really teach them that, can I? Well, Bishop Campbell started off as a history professor, so he's racking his brain trying to think of, well, yeah, when did we ever tell him? And he can't think of anything. He finally comes up with an instance during the Crusades where one of the armies goes and sacks a friendly city because they have some kind of monetary gain, and the Pope excommunicates them for a while. But I tell him, well, I don't know if that follows it enough or not without being able to actually research it. But don't you think it's a problem that you, as a bishop and a history professor, can think of only one example and it's 1,000 years ago?
Yeah.
What about the 20th century alone, where 32 million Germans fought for Hitler? And so he tried to say, well, Hitler wasn't really a properly instituted leader because he didn't have a majority vote in the Congress, the Reichstag, or whatever it was called at the time. And he realized once he said it that if he wasn't a properly instituted leader, that violates the just war theory. So I was going to bring that up, and he dashed off to another subject, and we kind of went round and round like that. Him trying to give me answers and me pointing out that no, the Roman centurion is not a reason why Jesus would support wars because of the reasons. Did he support the homosexuality or the sacrifice? Well, no, that's not a good answer either.
Yeah.
So he eventually just says, Mr. Dean, this meeting's over. No, before how was he saying it? I was getting frustrated with him, and I said, and Bishop Campbell, the just war theory is not even Christian. It's Cicero. And he looks at me like I was the dumbest student in his class. Sam, much of what we believe is Cicero. And at this point, I mean, it felt like, did you ever see the movie A Few Good Men, where Tom Cruise, the lawyer's badgering Jessup, the Marine Corps colonel, at the end to say, the obvious thing that he's never going to say, and he just blurts it out?
Yeah.
It was like that. He said that, and we both just looked at each other. He's looking at me like the professor who has to teach, somebody who should know better than to ask a stupid question.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, then what the heck are we doing here?
Yeah.
Why are we even in this Catholic Church thing if much of what we believe is Cicero?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Amazing.
And it's okay. I'm not sure what to do that. I'm just going to shut up because I don't think anything I'm going to say at this point is going to do anything except get security called in on me.
Yeah.
And so he finally tells me the meeting's over. Just it's time for you to leave. And I sit with that for a couple of weeks because I don't know what to do with it. I mean, I talked to my wife about it, and she's, really, the bishop said that. And I finally wrote Charlie, and thankfully Charlie wrote me a very good letter back explaining just what it meant. He sent me some, good literature from Father Mackenzie, Reverend Mackenzie, talking about that very issue. And sure enough, much of what we believe is Stoic philosophy.
Interesting. I didn't really know that. I mean, I knew that with the just war theory, but interesting.
Yeah, for my
Yeah.
bishop to say that, that's one of those responses that makes it hard for me at times to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the Few Good Men analogy because I've had that experience too, where you confront somebody or you try to talk to them about it. And at first they do, it's like the first level of the conversation, they're trying to defend the just war theory. And then
Yes.
once they can't, if the fallback is always, yeah, but if we didn't have it, it would be horrible. So, it's like
Yes.
we need it. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. It's not logical. It doesn't ever, no one ever applies it, but we need it there as the ultimate loophole because if we didn't have it, we'd be
Hmm.
in trouble. And so it's like,
Yeah. I don't know how. They can't explain that.
yeah. They think, well, I think they think that we would be vulnerable, et cetera. Like, basically what they're saying is what Charlie always says, which is that Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about. And
Oh, yeah, Jesus is naive because I like to ask, you mean the guy in the Gloria, that Jesus, that guy? When people are trying to explain to me that we can't do that stuff, you have to be a realist. Oh, you mean Jesus, that he's not really a realist. Isn't that the guy in the Gloria? You know,
yeah, the one that we're worshiping is, yeah,
worshiping is, yes.
yeah. So where did all this leave you? What are you going to teach your kids about this issue?
Yeah, I teach them what the just worth theory is. I teach them what it is. They have to know that. It's a church teaching of sorts. It's category 8 tolerated opinion. And then I teach them that the only other teaching that I know of are the teachings of Jesus. And that's the first level from the mouth of God. And this is what he teaches. And when I first got out of the army, my wife and I, in the quiet mornings, we read the Bible. And one of the things that surprised me was some of the Old Testament scandalous things. But the New Testament, it seemed like Jesus really meant what he was said. I mean, he wasn't just kidding around. He wasn't
Mhm.
talking in some philosophically obtuse manner. He was very down to earth, very blunt, very straightforward. And
Mhm.
I became concerned that if I didn't follow what he was teaching, that I wasn't following if he's God, if he's the guy in the Gloria, I've got a problem. So those are the teachings of the church. Nobody's ever told me that you don't follow Jesus officially,
Right.
um,
Right.
because
Yeah.
they can't. I've asked for dogmatic teachings other than the just war theory. I'm kind of in a back and forth with my church right now. I'm still pushing my children because I've taught them the true history of the just war theory, what Jesus teaches. In CCD and in youth group, they tend to ask uncomfortable questions, and they talk to their friends who then ask uncomfortable questions.
We can't have
And
that. We can't have that, Sam. What are you doing? Come
no,
on. Just
you'll get a
fall in
quick
line,
response to
everybody.
that. Yeah, at CCD, the priest made the mistake of asking the kids, put your questions in this box and I'll answer all your questions. Well, one of them came up about the just war theory. And this is Father Charles Shunk, a very nice young priest. He came and told all of the CCD classes, the high school, the just war theory is just that. The catechism is wrong here. It's not a doctrine. And it is not required. You do not have to follow it. Well, that's it, because he was tired of kids asking, well, when do we ever follow it? They started asking those unfortunate questions. Too many
Yeah.
kids were doing that. So, yeah, you don't have to follow it. So pretty much everyone went to sleep. Oh, so we don't have to follow it. We're good. Well, but what do we follow, Father? You can't tell them you don't have to follow this. Now, don't you have to tell them what do you have to follow?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. And I find that, I've even had it as a Catholic teacher, I've had experiences where you, how do I say this without getting in trouble? If you want to teach gospel nonviolence, you also have to teach just war theory. You
Yeah.
cannot present just war theory. It is a teaching of the Catholic Church, and therefore you have to present it.
Yeah.
But if you teach just war theory, there's no requirement that you mention that you don't have to follow it, and
No.
there's
No.
no there's no requirement that you also have to teach what Jesus taught to show the difference and to show. It's like if you don't go with just war theory, you are not considered going with the Catholic Church for
Yes.
99% of the people out there. You are
Oh,
not
yes.
a Catholic. You're not
Yeah.
teaching what the church teaches. And so it's like, I just think, the fact that we always have to teach just war theory if we're going to talk about war, but we're
Yeah.
not required to teach, gospel nonviolence or, what Jesus actually says in the gospel.
Yeah. And if you
It's,
try to, quite often you'll get cut off and no, we're not going to teach that. Just teach the just war theory. Just talk about that.
yep,
Oh, yeah.
exactly. It's a huge problem in our church.
It is. And I've continued to push this. I've contacted Father Charles a couple of times. I talked to the pastor about it. And I talked to Father Charles this morning. I saw him in the hallway just to get one last data point before I talk to you. So, Father Charles, am I going to get a response to my questions about what do I teach? Okay, we don't have to teach the just war theory. You're absolutely right. I appreciate your courage in saying that. That's a big step. But what do we teach? And he started laughing, and kind of a nervous laugh. He goes, "Well, Sam, I'm really busy, and it'll be 6 months at least before I get to that." And in essence, it'll be 6 months plus 6 months plus 6 months, and just take however many 6 months you want.
Yeah.
And so I told him, "Well, Father, I've been waiting about 8 years for an answer." And he just laughed. "Well, what's 6 more months if you've been waiting that long, Sam?"
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
They just see you as like a pest, I guess, for bringing
it
this
is.
stuff up.
And I didn't leave it at that. I said, "Well, Father Charles, just this week, we've had 2 American soldiers killed in Afghanistan, 6 wounded, and we kill dozens of Afghans every week. We kill people all over the world. You're laughing about this. I don't think it's that funny." And he just chuckled and, "Sorry, Sam."
Wow. That's disappointing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's shocking how little we're able to care about murder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's not going to deal with it. Nobody will. My next step is now to go to the pastor and formally request what the teaching is for the church.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'll get it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that your church is sort of militaristic in their promotion of veterans and the military and all of that stuff? Do you ever bring that up with them and see if they could tone it down a little bit? Like, that you're sending a message to my kids when you do all this. And do you ever complain about that or bring it up?
We have as a family. My wife, Julie, is also a military veteran. She was 5 years in the Army. And she sent your letter from Catholics Against Militarism to Father Charles and to the pastor at St. Pat's and to the local parish here in Plain City. We live outside of Columbus. And the priest here, the very next week, they go to weekday mass there. And the priest said, "Hey, I got your letter. And, I think you're right about most of this. I agree with most of the stuff in that letter. I think we need to change how we do that." Because they would have couple of times, at least once a year, the Knights of Columbus would have all the military veterans up next to the altar, and they would read a little thing about them and talk about how great it was that they were in the Army. So Julie sent a letter along with the literature from Catholics Against Militarism. So he was open to talking to her about it, and she asked, "Hey, I would like to discuss it," but Father Charles Shunk and Father Stephen, who's the pastor at St. Pat's, will not talk to her about it. They haven't yet, at least. I suspect she'll get silence over it.
Yeah, yeah. It just reminds me of that story you were telling about that kid in Afghanistan. I think it was in Afghanistan. There's so much applause of these people who go into the military, total silence when it comes to the suicide rate among veterans. So what are we doing to people when we just keep applauding and celebrating something that's causing so much harm, not only to the people overseas, but to these people? They're wounding their souls, and we just don't. The Knights of Columbus are never going to have a fundraiser for the families of people like you, who mothers and children that don't have a father anymore because he's gone, because he did something that he couldn't live with doing. It seems to me that that's a huge problem that we're just so we will not address. We will not talk about it.
The VA has all kinds of counseling programs. There's never you go to those counselings. I haven't been to them. I luckily don't have PTSD. I know some good friends who do. And the militarism in society and the church, it's like it ramps up the pressure. It's like they're in a pressure cooker as it is already. It's hard to go through life with these issues. And when your church is all for it and it's wrong, these guys really struggle with that.
Hmm.
Um, it really bothers me. I try to work with guys that I know. There's some pretty good literature out there about the just war and the moral injury and the problems that our church has, and I've been able to give that literature to some of these guys, and it helps them. I've had them thank me about, okay, the people understand me. Okay, I'm not crazy. I'm
Right.
not nuts. This was wrong. I know it was wrong. Now they can start healing once they come to that recognition. But if the church is, lauding these wars and sending thank you notes to the veterans, we do that at CCD or the youth group, thanking people in the military for their service. That's very hard for a guy who's got PTSD. Don't thank him for his service. He doesn't want to hear that. He might want to be able to chew your ear at 3 a.m. when he can't sleep. Um,
Yeah.
but you don't thank him for his service because he knows there's nothing to thank him for. The things he did were horrific, and he's going to have to live with that for the rest of his life.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think if we had like a ministry like we do for, women who have had abortions to come to reconcile with God and to seek forgiveness, like if we could provide that path for veterans, but you can't do that when you're also saying just war theory, it's a just war. The government
Right.
tells you what to do, you just go along with it and you serve your country and it's honorable and that's the end of the story. You can't do
Exactly.
both, right?
You can't do because the guy who's sitting across from you would do that will call BS on you and likely turn your desk over on you and walk out.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they aren't going to put up with it.
Wow, it's a sad situation. I have one more question for you. I have this theory that your risk of going into the merit military is like multiplied by 100 if you have a father who was in the military or a grandfather who was in the military. It does seem to be
Sure.
a tradition in many families.
Hmm.
Do your kids want to go into the military at all? Having two parents? No. Okay.
No. No, and the older kids remember when I was gone so much. That was painful for them.
Yeah.
So they don't, and I've been very open with what happened um, in the
Yeah.
military, what I believe about gospel nonviolence. So I teach gospel nonviolence is first. The church has this teaching that they tolerate from Cicero. It's not Christian. And so kids get it. I mean, a young person, when you explain it to them, this is what Jesus teaches. Like, yeah, that makes sense. And this is what the just war theory is. And, kids understand intuitively that there's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
Um, and if that's what Jesus teaches, then why are we doing anything else?
Hmm. That's a good question. So you're totally converted to nonviolence now, gospel nonviolence.
I am, yes. I
Yeah.
believe it completely. Is it hard to do? It is in thought and actions. When I listen to teachers, talk about it, Charlie or some of the others, where, loving isn't just doing the right thing, it's thinking and believing. And that's hard because part of me just wants to, kick somebody on their rump when they need it.
Yeah.
Uh, it's reflexive. It's how I've been taught forever. So it does cause moments where I leave a situation, I have to sit down and I think to myself, yeah, that probably wasn't Christ-like.
Right. And I do the same thing all the time. I talk about it on my podcast all the time. And then I feel like such a hypocrite because I go do something
Yes.
in my personal life and I'm like, oh, that wasn't good, but if you don't have that standard, then you don't know, like you don't know. And so it constantly pushes you to really re-examine. It's not about if you were drafted, would you be gospel nonviolence or just war? It's about like every second of every day and every
Yeah.
relationship that you're in and constantly trying to love in a
Yes.
Christ-like way. And even the people that you don't particularly like or who are threatening you or coming at you in some way, and it's really 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 hard. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember when I was interviewing Jim Douglas, he was saying something about nonviolence, and I said, "Oh yeah, and then I went on to my next question, and he
Yes.
was like, "Ellen, stop right there," and I was like, "You're right. It's not a yeah thing at all." Yeah.
I think that's Julie's my favorite moment in all of your podcasts that we've listened to.
Oh really?
Yes.
Oh yeah, he's amazing. Because I was moving on to my next question, and he was just like,
He
"This,
stopped you dead in your tracks, like, you missed something, Ellen. Yes, you just missed
yeah,
the most important plot
yeah."
point. Yes.
Yeah, he's incredible. I'm glad you guys are watching the podcast and enjoying them. And thank you so very much for reaching out to me. And your wealth of experience, real world experience with this, not only in the military, but your search, your quest for the truth. It's just, I think a lot of people will learn from it and maybe start their own quest to go a little bit deeper into these questions. And so I think if enough of us are doing that, like eventually our priests and our bishops and the hierarchy, won't they have to respond in some way? I don't know.
Yeah, when that tipping point gets here, I don't know. I don't want my children to go through life not being taught. I don't want to show up, at the pearly gates and have to answer that stupid question, did you teach your children everything I taught?
Mm-hmm.
In the Army, those are the kind of questions you get from your boss. Did you do? And they ask you those point blank. There's no niceties about it. And I don't think when our soul is weighed that it's going to be beating around the bush. Did you kind of, sort of, it's like you did or you didn't. And I don't want to be there to then have to answer to my children's souls that they didn't know.
Yeah.
It's their choice when they get old enough that they're going to know what Jesus taught.
Right. They have to be able to make that choice.
Yes.
But you can't make the choice unless you actually know all the options. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, God bless you and your wife and
you.
your whole family, and keep in touch and let us know if you have any updates from this whole quest that you're on down the line.
Sure. Yeah, I'll let you know.
Or if you find a historical example when the church actually told their people not to go to war, let me know. We're curious.
Me too. Yes, I'm dying to know that. Everyone out there who's watching that, please, yes, post it on the the YouTube or wherever. I'd love to hear the example. But I don't think there is, and you still have the problem of that's one example out of thousands.
Right. All right. Well, we'll keep...
If I could say one thing to the veterans out there,
yeah.
If you start looking into this, what you're going to find is that you're either going to be first told that you really don't understand, and when they find out that you do understand, they're likely to tell you that you've got some kind of PTSD, you're crazy.
Wow. Okay.
And to just keep asking questions and read your gospel. It's amazing how clear and simple Jesus is. He doesn't speak in tongues. It's written to a 12-year-old age, and believe him.
Good words to end on. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks, Ellen. God bless.
God bless. Take care.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. I just finished my interview with Sam a couple of hours ago, and as I was listening to it and putting together some notes, I realized that we touched on a couple of things that we didn't really know. We didn't know how to explain in the conversation exactly what we were talking about. And so I thought I just would offer a couple of things here at the end as a little afterword to clarify a couple of things. So the first thing is at the 12-minute, 50-second mark, we were talking about what is just war theory. This has even come up on the YouTube channel before, because I often refer to it as just war theory, and somebody commented once and said, it's not theory, it's doctrine. And I always meant to come back to that point. So you heard Sam expressing some confusion too, like, is it tradition, is it doctrine, is it theory, what's the difference between all these things? So I remembered actually an email that I was included in from a while back that was really, really helpful. And it was one that Father McCarthy had answered. And I went back and I found it in my email, and guess who the person was who wrote the email to Father McCarthy? It was Sam. So it's kind of interesting. So I went back to my email. I'm like, oh, wow, this email that's always stuck with me as being very helpful was actually written by Sam. So last year, Sam wrote Charlie an email, and he said, if you have the time, I would like your understanding of the just war in the magisterium. I'm not even sure if I'm asking it correctly, but I'm asking because I've seen the just war called or used as a doctrine. The Catechism uses the word doctrine, but not as a formal doctrine, ? And so he goes on and he talks about CCD, and he says, in CCD, the older children were told by a Dominican priest that the Catechism is incorrect and that there is no just war doctrine. It is an idea that you can believe or not believe. He did not go on to explain to the children, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so his question was, you regularly call it a theory. Why and why not a doctrine, as the Catechism sort of does. And so the subject of the email was the Roman Catholic just war doctrine or what? So I too had wondered this question, so I wanted to share with you the answer. So here is the there's something called the degrees of acceptance and certainty of faith within the Catholic Church. I didn't know about this until like a year ago. I guess all the theology dorks study this in school. I'm just kidding. You guys aren't dorks. You're awesome. I'm totally kidding. But anyway, so there's 8 levels. Okay, so this has to do with acceptance and certainty of faith. So number 1 is called from the faith, the highest degree of certainty considered a part of the divine revelation and infallibly asserted. So number 2, the faith of the church. Church teachings that have been definitively decided on by the magisterium in an infallible manner. Number 3, teaching proximate to the faith. Church teachings that are generally accepted as divine revelation but not defined as such by the magisterium. 4, teaching pertinent to the faith or theologically certain teaching. Church teachings that the magisterium clearly decided for, albeit without claiming infallibility. 5, common teaching, teachings which are popular but within the filtered range of theological research, probable teaching, teachings with a low degree of certainty, those of this certainty which are considered in agreement with the consciousness of the faith, pious opinion. Number 7, well-founded teaching, teaching that is well-reasoned but does not, however, rise to being called probable. 8, tolerated opinion, but discouraged within, opinion tolerated but discouraged within the church. So these are the 8 degrees of acceptance and certainty of faith within the Catholic Church. Pretty confident. I've done a little bit of research. This is it right here. This is not anyone's opinion. This is what the church goes by. These are the levels, and this is what they're called. Okay, so that's that. So the question that Sam was asking is, where does the just war doctrine, theory, tradition fall in the level of, degrees of acceptance? So I'm going to share with you Father McCarthy's answer to that email because it was very helpful to me. Maybe it will be helpful to you as well. What Charlie says, if you've been listening to the podcast before, you know who Father McCarthy is. He says Catholic just war theory is the 8th level. Opinio tolerate. I don't know how to say these Latin words. Some might argue that it could be put in categories of certainty 5, 6, or 7. So some might argue that just war theory could be as high as a number 5. But what Father McCarthy is saying is that it's a number 8. But there's room for argument there. That's probably something that all the dorks debate in theology school. I'm just kidding. You guys aren't dorks. You're cool. So in any case, whether 5, 6, 7, or 8, no Catholic has to accept something in any of these categories, including Catholic just war theory. Only 1 and 2 are absolutely binding for communion in the Catholic Church. Okay, so that's that. Now I'm going to share with you an excerpt from episode 1 where Father McCarthy addressed this same issue, and so I'd like to share that with you. You can listen to what he had to say.
But your question, you said to me earlier, was actually 2 questions ago, which means it's probably 24 issues ago. You said to me something about there are 2 traditions in the church that you can follow, the nonviolent tradition or the just war tradition. There are not 2 traditions in the church. If you mean by tradition, capital T, that is a tradition that you have to follow in order to be in full communion with the Catholic Church. The tradition that you're talking about is small t, custom, practice. Let me, just because I know it almost by heart now, La Civiltà Cattolica. In 1991, La Civiltà Cattolica is the Vatican journal, if you will, that's been published since the middle of the 19th century by the Jesuits, and the Secretary of State reviews all articles in it before it is published. Now, in 1991, it was written in Jovita Catholica, and now remembering, this is edited by the Secretary of State before it's published. It is the Vatican's, if you will, journal, which means it has the approval of the Holy See on it. Here is the exact quote from La Jovita Catholica in 1991. Quote, "It becomes clear that theology has sustained the theory of the just war, in quotation marks, for many centuries, a theory which, however, never became official, which never was blessed by the magisterium of the church." End of quote.
Wow.
Just war theory is a tolerated opinion. It is not tradition. And regardless of how, just to be clear on it, regardless of how long a falsehood is presented, it can go on for 1,000 years. For example, that the Earth is flat. That does not make the Earth flat. Longevity is not a validator of truth. Therefore, we have a foundation document, a real foundation document, that the church itself says has the technical language is in section 18 and 19 of the dogmatic Constitution and Revelation from Vatican II. The words are that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have a special preeminence among all the books of the Bible. And when a decision comes between, and when a conflict becomes, we have to look there as to what is the will of God as revealed by Jesus, because that is the ultimate place where it is revealed. That being the case, it becomes important to recognize what things are tradition, capital T, and what things are called tradition, small t, which are just customs that have been brought in by various people and groups and so forth and so on. And quite frankly, have been supported by people who like that kind of, if you will, killing tradition as moral, because they have great power and great money and great wealth at stake. Remember, Ellen, always remember, St. Augustine, the founder of the just war theory, never said that his just war theory, his just justification of violence theory, could ever be applied to individuals. It was only a theory of state. And he said explicitly, where the individual Christian is concerned, he or she must imitate their Savior. This is the whole just war tradition is one big lie. And as you know, that was the thing that Goebbels and Hitler understood completely. Little lies you can get at, but if you make the lie big enough, there's no way to get your arms around it. And if you give it a little history, all of a sudden it becomes orthodoxy. Well, it's not orthodoxy. And finally, just one other thing. Yeah. Remember, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels existed after the original tradition. There was an original tradition before the Gospels were written down. Whether it was 10 years or whether it was 70 years is not important. The gospel tradition precedes the Gospel. But what the church teaches is that those Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, accurately and totally communicate the original tradition that precedes them that was necessary for the salvation of the human being. So when one says Christian just war theory, or Christian just war theory is tradition. It's not the tradition for the 300 years before Jesus, before Constantine, and before the Gospels were written. It's not the tradition. Because if it were the tradition, there would be in the Gospels Jesus making an exception to his teaching in way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and he doesn't make it. So,
Right.
This is really important, and no one ever teaches anyone about it.
All right, so I just thought that excerpt from episode 1 might come in handy here. And, I can't help but thinking about Bishop Barron's recent statement that he thought that the bishops needed to control and supervise and monitor people teaching things online in social media, people who claim to teach, Catholic teaching. It's just a little ironic to me because the people that want the control over, saying who can say what and who can teach what according to Catholic teaching, they're not teaching it themselves. I never learned any of this stuff. And most 99.9% of people never learn, where does the just war theory fall on this scale of 1 to 8? If you learn it's an 8, even if you learn it's a 5, but you don't have to believe it, then you don't have to accept it, then that's a totally different thing, right? If we teach just war theory, I think, in my opinion, we should be telling, students, Catholic students, soldiers, this is where it falls. That would be a different ball game. But the people who want to monitor the teaching are the people who are failing, in my opinion, when it comes to this topic, to actually teach. To teach these things. So anyway, that's why I feel like I'm going to just share this with you, and I'm hope and I pray that I'm not misleading anybody, but I'm doing my best. And if you want to, it's your responsibility to research this yourself, as Sam did. Look into it. Start asking around. So anyway, that was the first thing that we talked about. Is it theory, doctrine, tradition, whatever? I thought those things might be helpful. The other thing we talked about was moral certitude. So basically, I'm just going to put up the definition of laxism. It came up in the talk. It's a theory in moral theology condemned by the Catholic Church. Laxism permits one to follow the opinion that favors liberty and against the law, even though the opinion is only slightly or even doubtfully probable. So this idea that even if something is highly doubtful and highly, it's only slightly probable, you can't go with that and just think that it's morally okay. That would be defined as laxism, and it's prohibited and condemned by the church. So that is the definition of laxism, and what Sam and I were trying to say is that in our opinion, the way we see it, it seems to us that just war theory being at this level of acceptance and certainty in the church, and the number of people who just say, oh, just war theory, it's probably okay to go kill in this situation, even though the strict conditions of just war theory make it so unlikely to be a just war, and then everything we know about the reality of war. If you really strictly apply those criteria and conditions, the likelihood of it being moral to kill is so doubtful and so slight that to us it seems like it's laxism. So anyway, I hope I'm making a distinction between objective things here and our opinion on those things. So I hope this is helpful. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and God bless all of you who are listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.